Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on moving our exports forward, focus on transportation. Today's webinar is aimed at those of you who are looking to transport your goods but don't know where to start, by giving you top tips and takeaways from two experts who have been there and done that. In today's webinar, we shall be covering the pros and cons of different transport modes, the role of forwarders, freight pricing, import duties, taxes and insurance. We'll be giving you an overview of customs and an overview of documentation. We have two excellent speakers for you today. We have Mike Josypenko, who is Director of Special Projects at the Institute of Export, and who will walk us through the different modes of transport available and what you need to be thinking about. And we also have Sandra, Managing Partner of Strong & Herd LLP, who will drill down into all the documentation required from her vast knowledge and experience. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Mike to begin today's presentation. Mike.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Kevin. So as Ian mentioned, we're going to be having a look at various modes of transport, some of the advantages and disadvantages of different modes, and some of the things you need to be thinking of. So if we start perhaps here with slide one. Okay, one of the things that will impact on the choice of transportation that you have is who you're selling to in your business. Now, some people may be selling directly to consumers, whether that's through e-commerce or more traditional methods of selling. Others may be selling to trade clients, and they may be retailers, trade buyers, users of particular goods. Others may be selling through agents or distributors or resellers. Now, that will have an impact on a typical size of an order that you may be sending out. So, for instance, an order sent directly to a non-trade client, a private consumer, may be fairly small in size, which will impact on the mode of transport that's being used, whereas goods going to trade clients are more likely to have more items in and therefore to be slightly larger. And then again, moving up the chain, distributors and resellers will typically be buying in bulk. So again, that moves the ante up in terms of the size, the weight, the volume of business that you'll be shipping out, which will impact on your choice of transport method. Obviously, the product that you're selling is very important in this respect. Is it large? And of course, what one person means by large can be very different from what another. A large case for one company might be a large wooden box or a large cardboard box, whereas for another company it could be a 100-ton transformer that's going to be shipped out to be installed into a power station. It may be heavy in weight or hazardous, and hazardous goods are very strictly regulated by all methods of transport, but particularly by air freight, so there are very specific regulations and criteria that apply to those. Your goods may be valuable or fragile, in which case they may have special packing needs, or you'll need to select a mode that minimizes the amount of physical handling that takes place. Some goods may be subject to either tainting or damaging from other goods, particularly if they're sensitive to certain smells, or it may be the other way around. Your goods may inflict damage or harm onto other goods by nature of the product itself and its structure. Goods may be time sensitive or urgently needed, which will impact on the choice of mode that you think about. And of course, where you're selling to and where you're shipping to is an important factor, which will dictate the choice of method of transportation that you consider. Thank you. Thank you very much. So there are a variety of different modes of transport, and I've broken this up, and this is a fairly arbitrary distinction. The lines are not defined, they're very blurred, but if you're thinking of small consignments, and I've called that up to typically 200 kilos, the type of services that you're going to be using are either small parcel or express carriers, particularly at the lower end of that range, possibly even postal services, again, if you're at the very small end. Air freight services, which have the benefit of being very fast, but quite often quite expensive, but are very good for moving small parcels around over longer distances. And perhaps if you're sending goods closer to home within Europe, over distances of maybe up to 1,500 miles, road transport is quite often an option. And then at the other end of the scale, I've defined large consignments, and again, this is a fairly arbitrary benchmark, 10 tons, as typically the area where you might start considering other modes of transport, and these would typically be in full load volume. So you may have a full load road trailer to put all your goods into. You may ship goods by sea freight, in which case you may use a container, and you would typically load a full container with all of your goods, possibly at your warehouse, and that will be shipped intact to the destination. Obviously sea freight being more usable for long distances, whereas road is defined by the availability of the road network, so it tends to be across Europe. And again, at that large end of the scale, you have alternatives around either rail transportation or methods of transportation used by inland waterway, rivers, canals, etc. Not so prevalent in this country, but quite often used in other parts of the world. And quite often containers are the base vehicle to be used for that, but goods are moved by those methods of transport. And then in between that, you have a range of options for consignments between those ranges. And depending on where you're shipping to, you may choose to ship those by air freight, by road, again, closer to home, or for sea freight further afield. And for people in that type of price range, there are a range of options available to them, which typically are based around either part load movements or consolidated movements. So for instance, you may ship goods using a part load road transport service, which may be known as groupage or groupage. You can send goods by sea freight in a container using what's known as a part load or less than container load service, where you deliver in 2, 3, 4, 5 pallets and the goods are mixed with other goods and loaded into a container, an effective container load to be shipped to the country that you're shipping to. So a range of options there. Thank you. So making that choice between those will be based around a number of factors. Obviously the size we've mentioned already. One of the most common factors that tends to crop up is the speed of delivery in relation to the cost. And these are quite often diametrically opposed to each other, in as much as the faster the method of delivery usually means a more expensive method of delivery. So there is something of a tension between the speed of delivery that you can expect or that you can offer to your clients against the cost. And that will sometimes filter through as to the expectations that your client may have of that transaction and that delivery, as opposed to the budget that you've got to cover those delivery costs. At the end of the day, this is something to be discussed and negotiated with a client, and in some cases, if the client's worth keeping happy, you may choose to use a faster but more expensive method of transport, even though you haven't allocated for that, considering the bigger picture. But it's not just about cost and speed. There are a range of other factors to consider. Obviously, destination is one, and we've already seen how sea freight and air freight tend to be more useful for longer haul destinations, perhaps intercontinental destinations, whereas road is very good for short to medium haul distances such as European, but other factors may crop up as well. Your customer may be based in a landlocked country, perhaps in Africa, or perhaps in central states of the USA, several thousand miles away from a seaport, but perhaps only 50 miles away from a major international airport. So they may prefer to move goods by air freight, even though it might cost slightly more. You'd have to factor in issues such as the reliability, not only of individual carriers, but of particular routes. And not only how long it's likely to take, but is it likely to deviate from that? And is that deviation from the expected transit time going to cause your customer a problem? The security of the goods may be a factor, particularly if they are either high value or sensitive to theft. So you may want to consider a mode of transport that has minimum handling and a fast transit time, where goods aren't being left around in either in a warehouse or a quayside or a container yard with limited supervision. At the end of the day, the choice may not be yours to make. Your client may either insist, or they may wish to pay the transport cost themselves, in which case they're entitled to choose the method of transport that they wish and the carrier that they wish to use. But assuming you are making that decision, a good way of getting options and alternatives is to speak to a freight forwarder. And we'll come back to that in a few moments. Thank you. So the starting point is usually to get freight quotations, and freight costs vary by a number of factors. Obviously, one factor will depend on whether you're choosing to use a full load trailer or container, in which case you'll probably be paying for the use of that trailer or container, and you can load it to the maximum capacity or to the maximum weight limits for the roads that it's going to pass over. For the journey, specific journey time. But in many cases, freight costs are based around the weight and the volume. And it's important to bear in mind that it is the volume as well as the weight. Freight companies work with what they call volumetric weight. So if a goods only weigh 200 kilos, but they have a volume of 7 cubic meters, for instance, because they're large, because they're bulky, or lightweight, you may find yourself paying for the equivalent of the weight calculated on the volume. Now that's not a fairly straightforward calculation, because the ratio between the weight and the volume that carriers use to calculate rates depends on the different modes of transport. So my advice in that case is to check with the carrier. Whenever you're getting a quotation, be sure to give the carrier, the forwarder, all of the dimensions of all the packages that you're shipping, or if you've calculated it for yourself, give them the volume in cubic meters of the goods that you're shipping, and ask, whenever you get a quotation back, double check whether that quotation covers the volumetric weight as well as purely the gross weight of the goods. Some carriers and forwarders will quote you an itemized quotation, so they may include various parts of the transportation costs in the form of a type of shopping list, so ocean freight, handling costs, documentation costs, customs clearance, etc. Others will quote you an all-inclusive price for a specific sized and volume job. One thing that is an unfortunate factor of life when you're talking about international transport is surcharges. Carriers are operating in an international environment where certain of their costs, such as fuel, currency, vary on a day-to-day basis. So they're having to manage those costs, and they do that in the form of imposing surcharges, which can go up or down on a fairly regular basis, depending on movement in international markets for those factors. So again, be sure to ask, does that quotation include surcharges? If not, what are the current surcharges? And if you go back and do a shipment a few weeks after you get an initial quotation, check whether the surcharges are still the same or whether they've gone up or down in the meantime, because surcharges will change and carriers will not usually hold a quotation including out-of-date surcharges. One of the other factors that defines the costs and how much you pay, as well as the type of costs you pay for, is something called Incoterms. And I don't intend to go into this in any great depth at this point, except to say that Incoterms, otherwise known as international commercial terms, are a set of contract terms drawn up by the international chains of commerce, which define not only who pays for what in relation to an international transportation movement, but also who bears the risk. But they are an important part of any contract, and they will define what elements of transportation you have to pay for. If you're not familiar with Incoterms, then please do go to the link on the slide in front of you, or go to Open to Export and put in a search for Incoterms. You'll find a very useful article on the Incoterms, and it's something that's very important to get to know, because you need to understand how that impacts on your business. Thank you. Whenever goods are sent outside the European Union, there is a customs clearance process, both when the goods leave and also when they arrive at their destination. And in many cases, there'll also be import customs duties and taxes. Those will normally be the responsibility of the importer, except in specific circumstances when the seller is selling on to what's known as delivered duty paid Incoterms. Effectively, that means that the seller is paying for all of the costs, including the import duty, including any taxes in the destination. In which case the seller becomes the importer of record. I would advise avoiding that if you're not familiar with international transportation and customs processes. In most cases it will be the importer's responsibility. The exception being when goods are moved within the European Union, and provided those goods are in free circulation, they're not usually subject to customs formalities or any import duties. But it's always worth checking whether your product may be subject to special customs treatment. It's always important to know how much import duties are likely to be. for your goods, even if you're not paying them yourselves, because they will impact on the final sales price of the goods. So it's good to understand what the rates of import duties are, and the starting point for that is to know what the customs tariff code is for your product. Once you know that, you find out what the import duty is in any given country, and that'll be covered in more detail at a later stage. It's worth bearing in mind that some countries have thresholds where they don't bother collecting import duty. So import duty is theoretically applicable, but the customs administrations don't collect it because it's the value of the money they collect isn't worth the time to take it up. That can be useful to know. So for instance, in the USA they have a relatively high threshold, whereas in Canada next door they have a very low threshold. So we're talking about the difference between $800 in the USA or 20 Canadian dollars across the border. Obviously, if you're selling goods to private individuals who aren't familiar with the procedures for international trade, it's even more important to make it clear to them whether import duties will apply or not, because they may be expecting you to cover the cost of any import duties in their country, whereas you're expecting them to pay that. So what you don't want is an unhappy customer that's going to give you negative feedback. Thank you. Another very, very important factor here is packing your goods adequately. And I can't stress this highly enough. Any goods moving internationally, whatever mode of transport you use, are going to be subject to far higher levels of risk than a domestic delivery. They're going to be handled far more often, and in some countries the handling systems are far less sophisticated. So pack goods more securely than you would for domestic transportation. If you're using cardboard boxes, please don't reuse boxes maybe the goods were delivered to you in, because once they're used once, they lose some of their strength and integrity. When you're considering how to pack goods, consider the risks of the different types of damage that they might incur. So they could be moving around in transit, perhaps within a container on the high seas. They could impact with other goods. They can be damaged as a result of climatic conditions or humidity. If your goods are sensitive to humidity, you need to pack them in such a way that they're protected. And don't just consider the destination that you're shipping to. You may be selling to New Zealand, which has a very similar climate to the UK, but to get to New Zealand, you've got to cross the equator, where they'll encounter very different climatic considerations. So you've got to take that into account. Also, find out how often the goods will be handled and by what method. We tend to assume that goods are always handled by automated processes which take good care, but that's not always the case in all countries. Another factor to consider, in many countries follow what's known as the ISPM 15 convention. Now this is an international convention covering use of wooden and timber products for packaging materials. Many countries forbid the use of wooden packaging materials unless they've been treated either by heat or by chemical treatments to remove any potential pests or infestations. So if you're using wood in any type of packaging, whether that's cases, crates, or purely as dunnaging materials to secure goods within a container, it's very important that it should be treated timber and it should be stamped with the treated mark. And if you're not sure, talk to your export packer or your timber supplier. If you don't do that, then goods may be held up at the destination. You incur a lot of costs. Another very important factor is insuring goods. Important to bear in mind that carriers and forwarders, like many businesses, have conditions of sale which limit their liability if goods are damaged or lost while in transit and in their care. So you shouldn't expect to get a recovery for the full value of your goods. The value that they pay out to you, even if they have to accept the responsibility, will be limited to certain conditions which depend on the mode of transport. And in some cases you may send out goods that are worth several £1,000s, and if they only have a small weight, because a lot of these conditions of carriage are based around weight considerations, you may get only a fraction of the actual value. So be aware of that, check the conditions of carriage with your carrier, but even more importantly, please do consider getting cargo insurance cover. Cargo insurance will cover you for the full value of the goods. You can either get that from the carrier or the forwarder as an extra fee on specific requests, so don't assume they're providing it. You can also buy cargo or goods in transit insurance cover from a broker, an insurance broker. So for instance, if you have an insurance policy for your general business, you can quite often get goods in transit cover as a fairly reasonable add-on to that. Always recommend getting cargo insurance cover, but be very careful, going back to the point I made a moment ago about adequate packaging. Neither insurers nor carriers will allow any claims if they find that the cause of damage was inadequate packing. An insurance company will disqualify a claim and a carrier will refuse to pay up. So please, as I mentioned before, pack your goods adequately. Seek expert advice from an export packer who can give you good advice and even provide a packing service. Thank you. We mentioned earlier about the role of freight forwarders. The easiest way to describe them, a fairly loose description, you can think of them as a travel agent for freight. So they're specialists in international transportation, and their business is in arranging transport on your behalf. So they will book consignments with carriers, they will deal with all of the different elements of a movement from one country to another. That includes documentation, they will arrange to collect the goods from your premises if necessary, they will deal with customs formalities, they will help in producing transportation documents and other documents that may be necessary. They can also provide advice on reliable services, reliable carriers. So if you need to ship goods to a country but you're not sure which option to choose, they can give you comparison quotes for different modes and hopefully tell you which are the most reliable carriers to consider. They'll often provide what are known as ancillary services or added value services, and packing, as I mentioned a moment ago, is one of those. Or insurance. You may also want to have a delivery or a distribution option if you're looking to set up in a country and you need to deliver in more than one country. They can quite often provide facilities such as fulfillment, deliveries or distribution. Freight forwarders also get involved in import customs clearance formalities, whether that's goods coming into the UK where you're the importer, or overseas customs clearance for goods that you've sent out. So they will arrange the customs clearance either themselves or through partner organisations, and in many cases they can pay the import duties on your behalf where necessary and bill it back to you. Many forwarders offer their own services, so they may get involved either in buying in large volumes, in which case they resell freight rates, obviously at a profit to them, but offering a very competitive rate, or they may offer services around consolidation, where they will make it their business to consolidate goods, small shipments from lots of different companies, and offer services either by air, by sea or road to cater for small parcel movements or small volumes for people who can't afford to ship out a full trailer, a full container of goods. And forwarders come in lots of different sizes and shapes. So you can have the small guys around the corner who perhaps specialise in offering a local service, large companies that have a wide spread, and then at the top end of the scale you have multinational companies who may have branch offices in many countries around the world. You can have specialist forwarders in specialist products, so food and drink, bioscience, valuables transport, so specific methods of transport and products that have specific criteria will often attract specialist freight forwarders that have that expertise. Or specialist activities, so you can have freight forwarders that are specialists in project movements, so for instance large infrastructure projects, or exhibition forwarding where they deliver the cargo right to the exhibition stand on your behalf. Secure transport for money, valuables, bullion, fine art, etc. So they're transporting them under secure conditions. So a range of different forwarders to try and find. A good forwarder can save you a lot of money and make your life a lot easier. And if you want to find a forwarder, many places to look, but one of the ones I would recommend is an organisation called the British International Freight Association, or BIFA. They are the trade association for the international freight community. They have a list of their members, and their members will always adhere to their code of conduct, so that's a good starting point. So hopefully that's given you some insights on the practicalities of transporting. Over now to our next speaker, Sandra, who's going to talk to you more about the documentary and the regulatory requirements. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to have a look at some of the export documentation issues and also looking at how customs fits into exporting. So thank you very much, Ian. We'll start with the first slide. So the export documentation part tends to be required for three main reasons. One is it's required legally, and that includes for customs declarations, and also to verify export control regulations. But as your export is somebody else's import, you also have to check what paperwork is required in the destination country. And most of those requirements will be coming from the overseas customs authorities. And the final part within the legal is the payment of import duties and taxes, or even the reduction of those taxes legally. You may not be the person responsible for paying the duties and taxes, but you have to be aware that these are additional costs and they do increase the price of your goods. Now, Mike briefly mentioned Incoterms, and there is one Incoterm in the DDP, and that could mean that you are responsible for paying these duties and taxes, though we would recommend that you treat DDP with a very big degree of caution because of having to get involved in overseas customs regulations to comply with that term. Mike took us through the transport side, and for both the transport and a commercial point of view, you need to identify the goods. Part of that is if anything goes wrong, you will, or somebody will want to make an insurance claim. So you need to know what exactly moved and what value of those goods. And finally, we have a fiscal requirement for documentation so that you can get paid. But also, most exporters don't charge VAT, and often it's assumed that you don't charge VAT because it is an export. There is a VAT waiver. There's two different types, one for supplying within the EU and one for sending to countries outside of the EU, and both of those require specific evidence, and that's documentation. So we will have a look at that at the end of the presentation in a little bit more detail. Okay, thank you. So here's a chart which tries to summarize some of the key points and where documents are used in the sale of goods from the UK to a country outside of the European Union. It is actually a lot easier to ship goods around the EU because we are a customs union, and as such there are actually very few requirements for customs paperwork. So that is an advantage of looking at markets within the EU. When we go outside of the EU, and the example we've taken here is India, then there are a number of steps that come in that have to be assessed, and most of them require paperwork. So the very first step is getting the goods out of the UK, which, as we're a customs union, is also out of the EU. So we have HM Revenue and Customs, and an export entry has to be submitted to HM Revenue and Customs. This export entry tends to be completed by the freight company, but it is the legal requirement of the exporter to make sure that all information is correct. The exporter also has to get back a copy of this entry with what's called a goods departure message, which then proves that the goods have actually left the UK. Another organisation which is linked to HM Revenue and Customs also does some checks at this point. They are the Border Force. And the Border Force are looking to see if those goods can legally be sent to the company or that country that you are sending them to. So you do have to make sure that you're following export controls. Export controls is an extremely big topic and quite difficult to explain briefly, and there is another very good session on Open to Export that can take you through those steps. But if you are dealing with high-tech products, if you're looking at certain markets such as Iraq, then you need to consider, how are my goods controlled? That check is done by the Border Force before the goods leave. Documents are needed at export, and the two key pieces of information is the valuation and how are the goods classified for customs purposes. Now you can either call that a commodity code number, or you can call it a tariff number, or you can use the HS code, harmonized system. All three of those names are generally used for the same thing, which is a number that classifies the goods. And we will have a little look at that in a moment. But your paperwork should make clear what the classification is and the customs value. Not only so that the goods can leave the UK, but also for import customs clearance. So there is a repeat of that information. And in this example, Indian customs wants to know the value of the goods so they can assess customs duties and taxes, and also the classification of the goods for customs duties and taxes, but also to make sure that they meet product requirements, such as conformity issues. So when goods arrive in a destination outside the EU, as well as the value and classification, you are required to make a declaration of origin. So that must be on your paperwork. And sometimes the overseas customs require that to be a separate certificate, often stamped by a Chamber of Commerce. So that's where we get the phrase certificate of origin, which we will have a brief look at. But what's growing more and more internationally is the requirement to prove that the goods you're selling into that market meets their local conformity regulations, meets their standards. And those checks are done on arrival, as well as the calculation of duties and taxes. So there are lots of steps and bits of paper and declarations into customs computers. Make sure that that is clear to the authorities. Okay, thank you. Okay, Ian, thanks. So I mentioned this commodity code number, as I prefer to call it. This is a simple way that customs internationally can identify goods. Instead of you having to translate descriptions into different languages, we have a system of codes which are in the harmonized system, which give a generic category to all products. These codes are broken down into chapters, harmonized headings and subheadings. We also require an EU ending as well. So when you export out of the UK, you must make sure you have a minimum of 8 digits on your paperwork. And those 8 digits will reflect the type of product that you're exporting. It is a legal requirement to get this number right, because it has a very big impact, not just in statistics at export, but it will be used to make your customs, your customers' import customs declaration, and that's where we get a financial impact of this number. The tariff doesn't stay the same, so commodity codes are assessed globally every 5 years, and we have a new issue of the harmonized system due, well, it's out now, but it will become in place in most countries in January 2017. So you do have to make sure you're keeping your numbers up to date. Okay, thanks. Okay, 2 key documents that you have to produce. An invoice. Now, it may not be a chargeable shipment, but all goods that move, especially outside the EU, need a shipping invoice that describes the parties involved, describes the goods with the code number, and shows what are the contract terms, so that it's clear who is paying what and who's responsible for which actions along the supply chain. It must also show values. Even if it's free of charge, you need to show a value. And although there are world rules on valuation, the simple thing to keep in your mind is, if it is a transaction, if it is a sale, you must always show the sale price. You cannot reduce that price despite what customers may ask you to do. That is the price of the goods. That's the price you have to declare on the invoice. If it is not a sale, then you either have to show an identical price, maybe it's free of charge replacement, or a similar price, a price for the goods that are similar to what you're sending out. In no situations can you put a 0 value for customs purposes. You must always have a value. And if you are tempted to lower those prices, perhaps due to pressure from a customer, be aware that you are assisting potentially in defrauding their authorities. So it is a serious thing to get the values correct on the invoice. The other document that is required is a packing list. You need to clearly describe what's going and how they're packed. That's required at import for customs inspection purposes. But if you're only sending one box or two boxes, then you might find that you're able to put this information on the shipping invoice. As long as you have a clear way of identifying what the goods are and how they're packed, then if it's a combined document, that's acceptable in most cases. Two areas where it isn't is with textiles and with food. Then you do have to have a separate packing list. And those are two very important documents that an exporter must get right. Okay. How do we know what paperwork is required by the overseas authorities? Now, you may be aware of this website. It's called the Market Access Database, or MADB, and it's a free website via the European Commission to assist EU exporters. It works against what they call product code, but I would call commodity code number. So you put the first 4 digits of the commodity code in, and then you select your country. So the example that we're looking at is for calculating machines, code 8470, going to China. There are 3 columns that cover information. Column 1 is a country overview, so you can click on that and get a general view of how that country deals with preferential trade agreements, sanctions, what harmonized system version they're using. The middle one are all the documents required at import. Now do be careful looking at that, because unless you are supplying DDP, you will not be the person responsible for the import declaration. And also transport documents such as the airway bill, bill of lading, railway bill, they will be created by the freight company, but you have to make sure that they're available and sent along with the shipment. The third column is the one that is a little bit different from other sources of information. This gives you specific requirements for that category of goods. So here with the example, we have a document, the third on the list under specific requirements, the China compulsory certification. And under that, the declaration of conformity. If you click on that, it will tell you a bit more specifically what type of goods are caught by that. You know, it might be franking machines, but not your data recorder. And then it explains who gets it, where you get it from, how long it takes, and whether there's a cost. So it does give you a lot of information on this website, so it is a key tool for anybody who's looking to export. Market Access Database does not assist with documentary requirements when going into another EU member state, because we are a customs union, so there shouldn't be any special documents required. Okay. If we move on to origin, this is something that is mandatory. You do have to declare the origin of goods. Now, the official word for this is non-preference origin. Origin to identify the nationality of the goods. I do prefer to call it nationality, where the goods were made, where the last significant economically justified process took place, to use the actual legal jargon. Nationality of goods, non-preference origin, is used for a variety of reasons. Generally at import, but again, let's come back to the fact that your export is your customer's import, so you do need to make sure that you're declaring correct origins. At import, it could be linked to product conformity checks, because the government and the Customs Administration may have highlighted certain products that need to be inspected, but they may be okay if it comes from an EU country. So they might actually say, well, but we'll only do these checks if the goods are not of these origins. So it is important for that. There are also tariff measures which might be in place against the origin of certain goods, and this could lead to higher duty rates, often called anti-dumping duties. An example here would be sending bearings such as ball bearings, radial bearings into the USA. In an attempt to protect their domestic industry, they have additional duties on bearings that are made in certain countries by certain manufacturers, for example, Switzerland. So you have to provide, in that case, not just the origin of the goods, but also the manufacturer's name. And we find that a requirement in some of the Middle East countries as well, extending origin from just being a country to being actually the manufacturer. And some of that can be linked to embargoes, sanctions, or boycotts that that country has in place. As long as we don't positively agree to boycott another country or customer, we're okay in making what we call positive statements. There are no Israeli goods in this shipment, for example, could be one of the statements. Origin is also used for trade statistics, and it can be used to reduce the duty that's charged at import, but don't confuse this with preferential trade. Preferential trade is when we have specific free trade agreements with markets. So it is mandatory that you declare where a product is made on your paperwork. Normally it would appear on your invoice, but sometimes customers or customs authorities will require that to be confirmed, certified on an official document such as a certificate of origin, which you get via a Chamber of Commerce. Okay. We mentioned free trade agreements. These can also be called preferential trade agreements. The EU have lots of trade agreements with other markets, and the main aim is to make EU manufactured goods more attractive in these countries because the duty is reduced, often to zero. We don't have these trade agreements with all countries in the world. They do take quite a long time to negotiate, and when they exist, really exporters should be using them to get into those markets. I often find that UK exporters only learn about trade agreements when a customer, say in South Africa, says, can you provide me an EUR1 form because I can't import the goods without one. We have a free trade agreement with South Africa. They can import without an EUR1 form, but it will mean that they'll be paying a full rate of duty. So it is actually like giving them a discount, and that's the way it should be treated when you're looking at the markets you're going into. Okay, the market access database, which is on the next slide please, also has a page called tariffs. This is an example of a very recent EU free trade agreement. It came in on the 1st of January this year, and it's with Ukraine. If you have a look in the middle, you'll see that there are three columns on the right-hand side. One is general, GEN. If you click on that, it will tell you the countries that are going to have a 30% duty rate charged at import. Then we have in the middle FN, most favoured nation. That applies to all members of the World Trade Organization, which includes ourselves. And then we have a special EU rate because of the free trade agreement, which, as you can see in this example on this, the men's and boys' overcoats, means that EU manufactured clothes will go in at zero duty, whereas most favoured nation clothes will be 12%. So there is a positive advantage. So if we look at the next slide, you can see briefly the different countries that we currently have EU free trade agreements with. This list is available on the Europa website, and of course once the slides are posted on the Open to Export, you can revisit this. There's a wide variety of countries, and we have lots of other trade agreements being negotiated with South American countries and also other Asian markets. The next one, which has been signed but has not been implemented yet, is with Vietnam. So constantly reviewing and trying to get good market access is an important thing that exporters should be looking at so that they can decide which markets to address, which ones would actually have the EU goods. Turkey has a special agreement with the EU. So if we have a look at the next slide, there are some goods that come under an associate trade agreement. Not all goods, so unfortunately foodstuffs, certain chemicals, iron, steel, they don't come under this special agreement, but industrial, commercial, manufactured items do. And this agreement is based on something called free circulation. So it's not an origin preferential trade agreement. It means that the goods are either wholly EU, or you may have imported it from other countries but pay EU duty. That means the goods can circulate around the EU and can also go into Turkey without duty being paid again. The form is known as an ATR form, and this is a preferential trade agreement, but it's not based on origin. It makes trade with Turkey much cheaper, so it is an advantage to both Turkey and EU exporters. We do have to be able to prove, though, that our goods qualify under these preference agreements. So on the next slide, we can actually look at a system that instead of issuing forms, such as EUR1 forms or ATR forms, we can become an approved exporter. It's nothing to do with authorised economic operator status. This is purely to do with preference, and you will be given an authorisation number that replaces additional forms. This came very much to the fore when the free trade agreement with South Korea was signed, because South Korea refused to accept documents. So if you're hoping to trade with South Korea under preference, they will only accept approved exporters who put the statement on the invoice. And that has made a lot of UK companies go for this system. But once you've got this, you can extend the countries, and this means that it reduces the number of bits of paper that you have to do for exports. They do check that you understand the rules of preference when you apply. So you do have to be ready to answer questions by customs. One of the questions they will ask is, do you know that your goods qualify for preference? And you may have bought these in from another supplier. Could be a UK supplier, could be an EU supplier. So on the next slide, we have what's called a long-term supplier declaration. If you are issuing preference forms or making approved exporter declarations on your invoices, then you do need to make sure that all the goods you buy in are coming with a long-term supplier declaration, which confirms that they meet the rules of that preferential trade agreement. Currently, formally, I should say, these forms were valid for 12 months, but with a change of law in May, they can now be extended to run for 2 years. If in doubt, don't sign these long-term supplier declarations if you're asked for them by your customer, and if your suppliers don't give them you, don't issue preference documents. Okay. Right. The next one is really important. This has been on the increase for the last 4 or 5 years, really starting with Russia and India under technical regulations. As things seem to get simpler from a customs point of view with the amount of documents they want and certifications, we have seen coming in an increase on checking the standards and conformity of goods. This was under pre-shipment inspection, and there still are pre-shipment inspection situations where the government in your customer's country will say no goods can come in until an external auditor has checked the contract terms, the value and the goods, and making sure the goods conform to our standards. That's being replaced a little bit, although there are still some PSI contracts for African countries, and it's being replaced by either inspection on arrival or pre-verification of conformity. Pre-verification of conformity means you can get your products approved so that you have a certificate to say, yes, they meet the standards in this country. And once you've gone through the approval, then a copy of that certificate goes with the shipments, which means you don't have to have it inspected each time. There's that, or there's registering goods with import authorities. And this is one of the aims of the technical regulations that both India and Russia have been bringing in. So do watch whether your goods need to be pre-inspected or have verification checks on conformity. And the market access database can give you that data, as could one of the inspection agencies. And we list the 5 main ones there that operate in the UK. And you can use their website or you can ring them up for further information. Okay, excuse me. Right, finally, we mentioned right at the beginning that you may not charge VAT when you export goods. And that is correct, but you do have to provide evidence for VAT purposes. And there are 2 types of acceptable evidence. One is commercial, and that is the usual requirement. And in fact, when you sell within the EU, you can only get commercial evidence because there's no customs declarations necessary for the majority of goods. So commercial is getting a transport document, a proof of delivery, added to other paperwork to prove that the goods have actually left the UK. For the EU, an additional requirement is to get the VAT number of your customer, because if they are not registered for VAT in an EU member state, you do have to charge them VAT at the UK rate. When we're going outside the EU, we can still build up our evidence for VAT on the commercial basis, but these goods do have to be declared to customs before they can leave. So if you get a copy of that export entry with the goods departure message, you now have what is called official evidence of export. And there are some areas of concern with obtaining evidence of export. One is selling under an Incoterm Ex Works, because if you're not controlling the transport, then you may not be entitled to the evidence of where the goods have gone. UK Customs actually recommend that if you trade Ex Works, you should charge VAT, and then when you get the correct evidence, credit it. That may not be practical, but it is something you have to think about. There are also specially controlled situations, such as goods coming in and going out for repair, or your goods require an export license. And in both those cases, if they're going outside the EU, you do need official evidence of export. So do concentrate on this. UK Customs realise that there's been some issues, so on the next slide we give an extract of the VAT notice. Okay. Notice 703, which was updated in 2014 to include this statement. It's been updated since, but this is when the statement came in. And this is telling freight companies that they must give exporters evidence that the goods have left. So if you do have any issues with freight companies saying they can't provide evidence of export, you can refer back to this VAT notice. Okay. So in conclusion, exporting can appear daunting. Depending on what country you're going to, there will be additional requirements. So do select your markets carefully, but do research as well. Look at the market access database. Check with your customers what paperwork they require, and know what UK regulations apply. But exporting is fun and it is profitable, and I would really recommend anybody to do it. Okay, thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Mike and Sandra. That was a really in-depth and wide-ranging presentation. We covered a lot there, and we had a fair few questions, and we have limited time left, so we'll only ask a couple now. And don't forget, we will be posting these questions on the website after the webinar. So the first question I'm going to ask is one we have pre-sent in. and it comes from Kirsty, and she asks, often business managers ask for items to be hand carried to global destinations. What would be the best process for obtaining the correct documentation?
Do you want me to take that one, Mike? Hand carrying goods often seems an easy thing to do, but it isn't. If you're going around the EU, then there are no customs, so you may be able to do that simpler by making a declaration to the airline or the ferry that you're actually carrying goods. But when you're trying to send goods outside of the EU, all those steps that were on the early slides still apply. The person hand carrying the goods must have the correct paperwork, must book an appointment with UK Customs, the MIB officer, merchandising baggage, make sure that the goods are correctly stamped out. If it's a commercial export, you have to think about getting your evidence of export as well, otherwise you may not be able to support charging VAT. It's very difficult, and I normally say to people, don't do it. Surely there's another way you can ship it out instead.
Thanks for that answer, Sandra. I think that covers that. I think the advice there was don't do it. We had a question in from Caroline Aspinall, and she's asking the question, will forwarders be offering facilities to weigh LCL and FCL shipments, so that's full container load and less than container load shipments, for the new verified gross mass requirement?
I'm happy to answer that one. Just to put this in context, there is a new regulation which is coming in on the 1st of July, although there is some talk of a period of grace. And basically that requires any containers that are shipped by sea freight from any ports around the world, not just the UK, to have what's known as a verified gross mass declaration before they can be loaded on board a ship for safety purposes. And this is not only a declaration of weight, but one which has been verified either by placing that container, that loaded container, onto a weighbridge, which allows the mass, the weight in other words, to be recorded accurately, or by a process of calculation. Now the obligation in this regulation is on the company that's named as the shipper on the bill of lading or the transport document. And the reason for this question, I suspect, is because many companies, freight forwarders, carriers, offer what's known as a consolidation service that we referred to earlier, and under that process they become the shippers. So they're the ones who are having to make that verified declaration, but of course they're receiving cargo from a number of different companies. There is no official rule on this. The obligation is on them, but I suspect that any freight forwarding company that is offering a sea freight groupage or LCL service will have to offer a weighing facility simply to provide themselves with security that the weight of the goods which are being delivered into them, which they're loading into a container, is the same as is declared by the shipper. Now it may be that shippers themselves are authorised so that their declarations can be taken as read, but in most cases they will want to check weigh them. But it is very much a matter to speak to individual carriers and forwarders. And if you have any doubts, or if you encounter a company that doesn't intend to offer that facility, then you may wish to check other operators around there. It is an international regulation. It is coming into force, so it's not possible to hide your head in the sand, but in this case the primary obligation is on the forwarder, so they will have to make provisions to satisfy themselves that they are fulfilling their legal obligations.
Well, thanks for that, Mike. I think the answer was fairly comprehensive from you. We've had another question in from Olga, and she's saying, you mentioned that the goods value must be correct and visible on a commercial invoice. What happens when you include packaging for the customer to use with your product, e.g. branded bags for the importer to use with their customers? And she doesn't usually charge for these. Previously, she'd listed these as packing materials in the commercial invoice with a zero value. Is this incorrect?
Well, I'd have to look at it as a specific case, but the instinct is if you're providing something free of charge, then it should have a value on an invoice. But as I said, you'd need to have a look at how the prices of the goods was actually calculated to see if it was already taken into consideration. But if not, and you are providing packaging for the goods for them to be sold in that market, that is what's termed under valuation as an assist, so it needs to be valued.
Thanks, Sandra. Right, we've had a question sent in by Alison Keats, and she's actually asking the question, how should companies select their freight forwarder?
Gosh, there are a number of factors. At the end of the day, you have to have a good feel about the forwarder. You should always check that they are knowledgeable and they're experienced. Obviously, you want to find a freight forwarder that's offering a competitive price structure, but often a good, reliable personal service that doesn't let you down can be worth far more than a few dollars or a few pounds saving on freight costs. There's no easy process. As I mentioned earlier, the organisation BIFA has a standard of conduct, code of conduct, which their members must uphold. So any company that's a BIFA forwarder has a certain level of compliance built in, but at the end of the day it's a commercial relationship, so it's down to who feels right. In the same way you may wish to go to recommendations, but treat it as a long-term relationship. Get to know your forwarder, speak to them in detail, see how much they do with your product, find out what experience they have in moving your particular type of product or in the markets that you deal with, what knowledge do they have about doing business in those countries. But at the end of the day, you want to have a good commercial relationship with them, so you have to be happy about dealing with them, and equally you have to be comfortable that they know and they will take care of your products.